Ever get that feeling like, man, there's just not enough time to learn everything I want to learn?
You mean besides this very moment?
Haha, exactly.
Yeah.
It's especially true when I think about someone like Ibn Sina. Heard of him?
Oh, absolutely. A fascinating figure.
He went by Avicenna in Europe, right?
That's right. And he's basically a legend over there.
But get this, centuries before the Renaissance, back in the 10th century, Ibn Sina was this, like, total rock star scholar in the Islamic Golden Age. We're talking like 1,000 years ago.
An era of incredible intellectual flourishing, and he was right at the forefront.
It's wild. Today we're taking a deep dive into just how impactful this one person's life was, and trust me, by the end of this you'll totally see why his story still resonates like over 1,000 years later.
And you're right to point out the timing. The fact that Ibn Sina accomplished so much in that era with the resources they had then, it's unbelievable.
Okay, so imagine this. It's the year 980, we're in Persia, and little Ibn Sina is already this, like, crazy prodigy.
A child prodigy in the truest sense of the word.
I mean, we're talking mastering logic and philosophy before he's even old enough to, like, drive.
Assuming they had driver's ed back then.
Right.
But seriously, it's important to remember that this was a time when knowledge was spread through manuscripts, painstakingly copied by hand, often. For Ibn Sina to have absorbed so much, so young, speaks volumes about his intellect.
And his drive.
Absolutely.
It's like those kids today who, like, graduate college at 12.
Right.
Except back then, they didn't even have Google to help with their homework.
Exactly. And what's even more remarkable, Ibn Sina didn't just stay in one place, buried in his books. He was out there, in the thick of it.
Oh, really? Tell me more.
Serving as a court physician, traveling extensively, navigating the political landscape. I mean, can you imagine?
Wait, so he's like this doctor on the go, advising rulers while dodging palace intrigue. That sounds like something out of a movie.
It practically is. And through it all, he was unbelievably prolific. We're talking about almost 450 works.
Hold up. 450. Like what? Okay, I need some context. What's his most famous work? Like the one they put on his author website, if they had those back then.
Without a doubt, it's the Canon of Medicine. This massive volume became the medical textbook in both the East and West for centuries.
Okay, but what made it so special? Was it just like a really, really long book?
Oh, it was long, all right. But the Canon, it wasn't just long. It was like revolutionary for its time.
Really? How so?
Okay, think about it. Back then, medical knowledge, it was all over the place, scattered. A lot of it based on tradition, not really like observation.
Right, right.
Ibn Sina, he took this crazy systematic approach, combining everything he learned from the Greeks, the Romans, Persians, even Indian sources.
So he was like the OG medical researcher, gathering knowledge from all over and trying to make sense of it all.
Exactly. He could synthesize information like nobody else, categorize diseases, outline treatments, discuss surgical procedures, even wrote about how contagious diseases spread.
Hold on. Contagious diseases.
Yeah.
Like way before germ theory.
Way before. It was groundbreaking stuff. But here's what I find even more fascinating about the guy, honestly. He wasn't content with just the how of medicine, you know?
Yeah.
He was obsessed with the why, like the nature of existence itself.
Okay, so we're going from like scalpels to the soul.
Exactly that.
Yeah.
He truly believed that to really understand the human body, you had to understand the soul and like its place in the universe. That's where his philosophical ideas come in. And let me tell you, they're just as mind-blowing as his medical work.
All right. You've convinced me. Ibn Sina, the philosopher. Where do we even begin?
Well, one of his most famous ideas is this distinction he makes between essence and existence.
You mentioned that earlier, something about a tree, right?
Exactly. Picture a tree, any tree.
Okay.
Its essence is like what makes it a tree, its roots, trunk, branches, leaves.
Okay, makes sense.
It's like the blueprint, right?
Right.
But its existence, that's the fact that this specific tree is here right now in this particular place and time.
So essence is like the idea of a tree, and existence is the tree actually being a tree.
Yes, you got it. Ibn Sina argued that those two things, essence and existence, they're distinct, separate.
Okay.
And this is the important part. He said that only God can combine both those things perfectly.
I see where you're going with this. So everything else in the universe, us included, our essence and existence are not totally combined.
Exactly. We're dependent on something else, something bigger, to bring our essence into being. For Ibn Sina, that was God.
Wow. That's a pretty bold statement for a philosopher, even back then.
Right. But he doesn't stop there. He's got this whole flying man thought experiment, too.
Oh, yeah. The flying man. Tell me more about that.
It's classic Ibn Sina, honestly, like peak philosophical creativity.
All right.
So he asks you to imagine this person who suddenly just exists, right? They're floating in midair.
Okay.
But there's a catch. This person has zero sensory experience, no sight, sound, touch, smell, taste,
Okay.
nothing.
Whoa. That's a lot to process. It's like being stuck in your own mind with no connection to anything real. Kind of creepy, actually.
That was exactly his point. Ibn Sina argued that even in this totally isolated state, the flying man would still be self-aware.
So he'd know he existed, even without senses.
Exactly. This thought experiment, it was designed to demonstrate that our awareness, our self, doesn't come from our bodies or our senses. It comes from something deeper, something inherent to the soul.
That's wild. That's like a radical idea even today, I think. It makes you wonder, what else did he figure out way back then that we're just now catching up on?
Right. It's a question worth thinking about for sure. But before we go too far down that rabbit hole,
Yeah.
there's one more super important part of Ibn Sina's philosophy we need to unpack.
Okay, hit me with it. What else is there?
His idea of the active intellect.
Active intellect. Okay. What's that all about?
So Ibn Sina, he believed that humans, we don't just like passively absorb info from the world, right? We're actively engaging with it, always trying to make sense of things, searching for patterns, for meaning.
So it's not just about, like, seeing a tree. It's about understanding, like, what makes it a tree, going beyond the surface.
Exactly, you got it. And Ibn Sina believed that this ability we have to really understand, to grasp those universal truths that go way beyond what we immediately experience, that comes from this higher form of intellect.
Which he called the active intellect.
You got it.
So it's like this inner drive to learn, to connect with something bigger than ourselves. It's almost like kind of a spiritual idea.
Definitely a concept that blurs the lines a little bit, you know? Ibn Sina believed that the active intellect actually connects us to a higher source of knowledge. And that connection, that's how we're able to see the interconnectedness of everything.
Okay, so we've covered medicine, we've talked about the soul, some serious thought experiments, and now this idea of like a universal intelligence. It's clear that Ibn Sina was a man of many, many talents, but like, what kind of impact did all of this have on the world? I mean, seriously, it's kind of mind-blowing, you know? This one guy, over 1,000 years ago, making huge discoveries in medicine, philosophy, basically everything he touched. How did his ideas even spread back then? Like, did they have carrier pigeons delivering his books to Europe or what?
Not quite carrier pigeons, but you're right. It's easy to forget how much slower knowledge traveled back then. There was a period, though, during the Middle Ages when Islamic scholars and European scholars, they were actually engaging in this really amazing exchange of ideas.
So like a global network of
Yeah.
book clubs.
Yeah, but with much higher stakes, you know?
Right.
They were translating these ancient Greek texts that had been preserved in the Islamic world. And of course, they were translating original works by Islamic thinkers, you know, folks like Ibn Sina. And those translations, they totally blew the minds of European scholars. It was like a whole new world of knowledge just opened up to them.
So Ibn Sina's ideas, the Canon of Medicine, his whole thing about essence and existence, the active intellect, all that made it to Europe. And it really shook things up.
Oh, absolutely. Big time. Thinkers like Thomas Aquinas, he's like one of the most influential figures in Christian theology. They were wrestling with Ibn Sina's ideas, debating them, incorporating them into their own work. You can't overstate his influence on Western thought. It's massive.
It's like this recurring theme with him, right? Ibn Sina bridging different worlds, connecting East and West, ancient wisdom, new ideas. It's actually pretty inspiring. Makes you wonder what he'd think about the world today.
That's a great question. I mean, with all our advances in science and tech, the access we have to information, I feel like he'd be totally fascinated. But also probably a little overwhelmed. I mean, can you imagine?
Yeah, totally. Like, dude, slow down, world. I need to catch up.
Exactly.
Okay, so as we wrap up this deep dive into Ibn Sina's world, what's the one big takeaway you want our listeners to remember?
I think the biggest takeaway here is that Ibn Sina, the guy known as Avicenna in the West, wasn't just this brilliant doctor or philosopher. He was this incredible bridge between cultures, across time even. His story reminds us that the search for knowledge, it's timeless, it's a human thing, you know? And ultimately, the greatest impact we can have is to leave behind a world that's a little more curious, a little more understanding, and maybe a little more open to the power of big world-changing ideas.
Well said.
Well.
And on that note, we'll leave you with this thought. If Ibn Sina could achieve so much over 1,000 years ago, with limited resources, constant chaos, and upheaval, imagine what's possible for us today. Like, We have access to almost unlimited information at our fingertips, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
what will you discover?